Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming today. So this talk is going to be all about food we've got, records of food we've got in the archives, and I have to say it's quite a long talk with the most slides we've got, but it's long for a good reason. It's going to be quite fun. This is roughly what we're going to be looking at. So I've done it as a list. So we're going to have shops, shopping lists in the kitchen, food storage, grow your own. Then we get onto the nitty gritty of it, sort of the actual, all the recipes we have. Then we'll look at a few drinks. Then we got at the end, we've got some local treats, so cheeses, things like that. Just one word that I didn't realise, that nearly all of the recipes we have are actually called receipts. And the word recipe was French, so actually it was very rarely used in English until much later. I, however, will use the word recipe because it's just what we're used to today. So moving on, look at shops. So as early as the 1300s, a grocer or purveyor was a dealer in comestible dry goods such as spices, sugar, flour, and later cocoa, tea, and coffee. Because these were bought in bulk, they were often named after the French word for wholesaler, grossier, hence the word grocer in English, which again is something I didn't realise. Most foods were bought in town markets, but certainly by the 1700s, grocers, butchers, fishmongers, and greengrocers were all commonplace. And these people would typically deliver their goods to clients who generally kept accounts with the various food suppliers, settling them usually on a monthly sort of basis. And this is a picture here as a butcher's from Winchcombe and a lovely sort of one of a delivery driver from the college stores in Cheltenham. Much of our material regarding household lists are naturally from upper class families, as these households usually kept accounts, so details of typical food purchases have survived. And at some point in the future I will be doing a talk just on shopping lists because they're so fascinating. So these are a couple of examples from Blathwaite family of Durham House in the south of the county, and they record purchase of lots of interesting things. Eels, which are spelled yells there. It's a crab, butter, lemons, mustard, flour, shoulder of mutton, apples, eggs, cheese, mackerel, fennel, and a ham. And you know, we've got a whole literally a bundle of, it must be about 6 inches deep of these sorts of things, so they're wonderful to look at. Some households only bought on a calendar basis, only buying things when they were cheapest. So starch, for example, was made after the harvest, so it was cheaper to buy then. So a family might buy the whole years of starch sort of September, October time. And this is a page in the domestic account book of Anne Beach, the younger of the Hicks Beach family of Colston Aldwyn. And it's a typical sort of page from an upper class set of purchases. It's got fish down there, an interesting species isn't given, often it was, so I suspect it's probably whitefish. It's got beef, so rib and sirloins mentioned, a calf's head, we'll look at them later because they crop up all over the place, mutton, neck and shoulder, and veal. Loin and veal was a popular one. It's also got bread, oatmeal, rolls, which the lack of anything, I think it was bread rolls, although they're quite expensive. I think they're a penny. There's 6 bought. There's a penny each, so I thought it's quite pricey. And there's sugar for the cider. Interestingly, birds purchased: snipe, teal, and larks. Over 24 larks. This is something we don't really think about today. We only usually see them if we go on holiday to France and realise there's little songbirds in the butcher's counters. But it was a real popular meal back here for the upper classes as well. Vegetables were rarely bought, to be honest, because most of them were obtained from kitchen gardens, while milk, like the butter and cream, often came from local farms or state farms, although, say, not always. The biggest purchases by most of the households of the upper middle class statuses, probably by lower as well, I would think, were meat and bacon ingredients, which feature heavily in most family archives. And these are just a couple of listings here from the Blathwaites. It's difficult for you to see these, I know, because we've gone it quite fast, but don't forget, after this there will be the exhibition that's put up usually as well, and that's coming in the next couple of days, and you can have a look at some of these then. So this is again a typical thing. The one on the right there is primarily sultanas, sugars, flours, that sort of thing. Looking at the kitchen, so food and kitchens, like clothing, education, and social issues, underwent a huge change in the late Regency, early Victorian era. Before this, cooking in England was really quite primitive and was done primarily over the hearth, on the spit, or in pots hung or in trivets over the fire. And bacon was done in large separate irons, and this is a typical sort of late Tudor, early Regency sort of fireplace. This is at Cutheel in Cornwall. Great big fireplace, really uncontrolled. You kept the fire going almost at full blast, and you varied food around it. By the early 1800s, with a lot more coal being burnt domestically, cast iron open fire grates, hob grates, another name, or open ranges or kitcheners were starting to be used. And this picture is a typical early Victorian kitchen with an open range kitchener. That's the fireplace in the back. It's got what you call a smoke jack hanging in front of it, turning a meat. Smoke jack chain, which you pull to turn the spits. And it's got a bottle jack, which is there, you can see in front of the fire. And of course, with the empty kitchen, there's the obligatory cat sat on the stool there. This is from this book, is available online to look at. It's quite nice. I recommend the website called Foods of England. It's an excellent website. It's really, really good, and it's free to use and everything's fantastic. So the first real big improvement, technical improvement in British cookery, came with the introduction of the closed kitchen range. And this is an example from the Holst Victorian House in Cheltenham. So it's a thoroughly great place. Recommend you go and look at it. And they also actually often light this up quite frequently. So at Christmas time, they'll bake cakes and things on it, which is great. So these usually had an oven, a boiler to heat water. You can see that at the top left, as well as hot plates to sort of fry or simmer food on, and also to keep it warm. They were wonderful things, and one of the main advantages, they ensured that soot no longer fell down from the chimney into the food, so it was a little bit safer from that. But of course, you did need a chimney for it. So the kitchen range with, say, typical oven, sort of plate rack, ventilating door, reversing damper to help control the heat, would have cost between around 17 to 19 pounds. So about sort of 1300 to 1500 a day. So though it's very expensive, it would have been no doubt the sort of the must have if you could afford it. Food storage. So as far as storing food and cooking implements, most kitchens use shelves together with cupboards and drawers. Most houses have a larder or pantry. A pantry comes from the French word pan for bread. You get it from, I didn't realise. Well, larger houses could go bigger. They usually had a dry larder, a wet larder, and a game larder. So dry larders stored bread, pastry, milk, butter, and cooked meats. Wet larders stored all uncooked meats, poultry, often game, and fish. If you're lucky enough to have a game larder, these were purely used just for game. So they usually had hanging hooks and racks and everything. There was a thing called a vegetable store, but it could be part of the meat or wet larder, but sometimes you were able enough to have a separate larder to be used. And then attached to the kitchen, you had the scullery, which usually had a copper for boiling water, sinks, and a drain where the washing up was done. So really, this picture we have here of the larder would not be approved of in most Victorian households. Everything is there for, you see, it's fish and lobster at the bottom, the hair hanging up, there's bits of meat everywhere. People wouldn't like that at all. That wouldn't be popular. So looking at growing your own, got this lovely quote here from a Frenchman in 1600: "No man need ever have an ill-provisioned house if there be but attached to it a dovecot, a warren, and a fish pond." Obviously, the big country houses often had these things, the small houses didn't, but almost every house had a garden of some sort where vegetables at a minimum could be grown. Larger houses typically had extensive walled gardens for fruit and tender vegetables, and large kitchen gardens and orchards. And this is just a look at some of the large gardens you find there. One of the top right there is Doddington Park. It's not North Points here. This map is drawn in a different way, but you can see sort of the houses and the church is all sort of in the centre. Above it, there's a line which is the lake, and above that is a row of orchards. To the sort of left there, you see that sort of darker green patch with the cross on it. That's the walled kitchen garden. It was quite huge. And then these are sort of some gardens shown from the various other places. So basically, right to left, we have Carolee, Elmore Court, and Miserdon. And again, you can see sort of the size of the gardens. You know, they really were important. And even houses in towns where they could would have a big set of kitchen gardens attached to them if it was at all possible. So we'll move on to today's menu. Let's see what we start with. Like most foods, we're going to start with some soup. So first bowl of soup, we think it was prepared around 20,000 BC. Believe it or not, they found some archaeologists found some evidence of this in the Middle East. And throughout history, the most common soup was pottage. This is from the old French word potage, which basically means food cooked in a pot. And pottage, it's really tasty. It's a thick soup or stew made by boiling vegetables, grains in some sort of pot. It's basically the forerunner to the soup makers we know it today. And it was a staple food for lower classes over many centuries. And it's usually made one day a week, and stuff was added into it as you went along. Literally anything could go into pottage, although for the lower classes, it tended to be mostly vegetables. Meat was a rarity. So we start off with this lovely soup. It's the clear soup. It's consomme. It fries off a bone leg of beef with chopped beef bones and mirepoix, which is onion, celery, and carrot mixture, herbs and black peppercorns for 20 minutes. Then you cover it with cold water, bring it to the boil. It's then boiled on the corner of the stove, i.e. simmered, because the stoves are difficult to control in temperature, so you tended to move the pots around on them to change the temperature. And again, with most things, they would skim the fat off as it rises, and then afterwards it would be strained through a fine cloth. It's going to be quite messy. If it wasn't clear, it was then returned to the heat and clarified with egg whites. That's how you clarify soups. But unusually, this one used the shells as well. And the egg, basically, the idea is here is the egg proteins catch the sediment and impurities, and then you're going to strain it through with the cloth again. And this also, interestingly, adds a white powdered sugar to finish off before it was served. So again, quite an interesting recipe. And I would say, we haven't tried any of these recipes, and I would probably suggest you don't either, unless you're really keen on cooking and want to give it a go. Primarily because, we don't know often what the cooking instructions were. That's one thing they do. They give us the ingredients and a little bit of instruction, but you don't get the details. So, if you do try these, it's on your own head be it, I'm afraid. Here's a nice one, a 3-meat soup. Uses beef, mutton, and veal, and it's basically so simple to make. You cover the meat with cold water, you brought it to the boil and let it simmer until a very strong soup is made. No mention here is made of salt, pepper, or herb additions, and this soup we think was deemed suitable for invalids, for ill people, although it's really going to be the well-off upper-class invalids whose families could afford this meat, because these aren't bones, these are pieces of meat. And you do wonder with a lot of these recipes, what happens to the bits you leave out? So what's going to happen to that beef, mutton, and veal? Presumably it's going to get used elsewhere, but they really don't say in these recipes very often anyway. A rabbit soup. So this is from the archive of the Martian family of Little Rissington. It's quite unusual because rabbit was usually stewed, roasted, or made into a pie. So a rabbit soup is quite unusual. It basically calls for 2 rabbits to be boiled in the onion until tender. Then they're jointed. The jointed pieces are set aside. And then the rest of the thing is cooked until the meat comes away from the bones, after which it's strained. You put salt, mace, cayenne. Cayenne crops up quite a lot, which is an interesting one, because you don't really think of these people using that sort of spiciness. But yeah, milk, cream, and then you thicken it with corn flour, essentially. Then the joints are returned to the liquid to warm up, and it's served. And again, it looks like this was also a food for illness as an aid to recovery. A lot of the soups were deemed for recovery soups, if you like. This is a conger soup. This is a fish soup. So usually fish soups are a bouillabaisse or stew style. So you have cuts of fish or shellfish cooked gently in a fish broth. But with this recipe, actually requires 6 hours of simmering. It uses a conger's head. This is a picture of a conger that somebody caught at Penarth Pier last year and dragged it up. It's a fairly small conger, to be fair. So this recipe uses the conger's head, 2 pounds of flesh, and 3/4 pound of bacon. And you wonder what happens to the rest of the conger in this one. After cooking, it's basically strained, making it a clear soup or a broth. Again, what happens with the meat that's left in this cloth straining thing? It'd be a waste of good conger, because conger does taste quite nice. Also, on this one, really interesting, it adds pears and herbs, which the pears especially are not too common on fish soups as far as I can find out. So it's a bit of an oddity. Giblet soup. Okay, I have to say, when I first looked at this, I thought, oh my God, this is going to be disgusting. But having read the recipe, it's not as bad as it sounds, although it did cook all day. So essentially, it used beef, onions, bread, and spices to make a broth, which was strained, fair enough. Then you stewed the meat again, and you add chopped goose or duck giblets to it. The first broth, then add the second, along with, again, cayenne, mushroom ketchup, and work at ketchups later, and white wine. And then the whole thing was thickened with the roux and served. So, to be fair, I suspect this might have been actually quite tasty. So look at some meat now. So we've done the first course, onto the second course. Meat, a very important element of the diet for medieval times, but really only if you were upper classes, the only people that could afford it. In terms of cooking, it was, in order of preference, roasted, stewed, or boiled. The roasting was far the most popular way. It's the easiest thing to do. Um, and roasting in front of fire rather than baking it in an oven. So today, when we say we've roasted the meat, we really actually aren't baking it in an oven. Roasting in front of fire gives the meat a much better flavour and it didn't dry out. And this is the fire grate Lanhydrock house in Cornwall. And you can see the number of roasting spits there, the turning mechanisms, and the big sort of fat trays underneath. And to the left of the photo, standing up are the fat basters. So you'd let the fat come down to the pans, you'd scoop it out and pour it back over the meat. So, you know, it would taste really, really good. And this fire could easily do a whole ox, I would think. It's massive. So to do this, to roast the meat, you actually spit it or you suspend it in front of the fire. You have various ways of turning it, and the little picture there is a clockwork bottle jack, which became popular in Victorian times. You basically wind it up, put it in front of the fire, set it going, and it would just rotate that meat slowly around to cook it all the way through. And again, roasting in an oven tray, in a tray, only became popular when the closed ranges were introduced. So it's quite late. So this is a great recipe. It's from the Smith family of North Nibley. Dates to around 1609 to 1639. It's the oldest recipe we have in the archives, as far as I can determine to date. It's a recipe for a beef suet cooked in a cloth bag, hence the name. It's to make a bag pudding, and it's cooked in beef broth. It's quite difficult one to read, so there's a little transcript for you. Take 3 eggs and beat them very well, and take a pretty quantity of cream, about a gill or a gill, how you pronounce that, and half. Then take beef suet, cut it reasonably small, take flour and blend it with the milk and the eggs, and blend it, not over sandwich, don't beat it up too much. Then take the suet and put it in with salt, little pepper, loosely beat it, put it in the bag, put it into your beef pot, i.e. in water, and then take it out later on when it's cooked, cut it in two and serve it on a dish. You know, I think that'd be quite tasty. And I'm sure a lot of us remember beef suet puddings or beef suet crusts, which are just wonderful. Not very good for you, but they taste lovely. I mentioned earlier about calves heads. They're pretty horrific to look at for us today. And if you look on the internet, some of the foods of calves head, they're awful, but they were very much a prized dish, often served whole, boiled, roasted, and trimmed, and usually put on as a centerpiece at the table, which you could then pick your way through afterwards. We've got this recipe here from the Recipe and Herbal Book of Anne Beach of Netheravon. It's a branch of the Hicks Beach family. Dates to around 1731, but we've got several recipes for calves heads, and we'll look at another couple later. That's it. Doesn't look very much instructions, but it requires a pair of calves head, washed well and then half boiled. I mean, it's disgusting already. Then you have to lard them, or you cover them with lard, bacon, thyme. No, it's thyme in there, spelt thyme as we spell it, rosemary and lemon grind, and you roast it. I don't know, is that edible? I'm not so sure myself. It looked pretty horrific, I think. This one's probably nicer. It's to roast a shoulder of mutton in the blood. Another recipe from Anne Beach. Again, like most recipe books of the period, these books also include culinary and medicinal recipes, get it right. And this one is actually above a recipe for a hair tonic. So, you know, you have to be really careful looking through these books. You're actually pulling out a food recipe, not a medical one. And also, this recipe is interesting because it's the only one in the archives that specifically mentions roasting meat on a spit. And again, the English is quite convoluted, but when your sheep is killed, save the blood, season your blood with hill thyme, which is the type of thyme that grows higher up. Can refer to anything really. Nutmeg, and salt it and stuff it on the underside of a shoulder of mutton, then wrap it up in the caul, which I think is short for calico cloth, bind it on the best way you can, spit your shoulder, and then you spit it and stuff it before you actually roast it. So again, it would be lovely, I would think, regardless of how it's done. Mutton, very popular. This recipe uses a bone piece of mutton that's stewed gently in a well-seasoned gravy made from the bones. This is getting something that we could easily eat and like, I think. Interesting, when it was half done, you put port wine to it, and then when it was almost done, you would use a salamander to brown the meat. And this is a picture of a salamander here. And it's basically a flat plate which you'd put into the fire, get red hot, and then you'd actually put it on or just above the food you're trying to brown. The idea was it sort of really crisps up the skin. So having done that with the stew and a nice crispy top, I think it would be actually delicious. The gravy then was strained and you added walnut ketchup, cayenne pepper, and anchovy essence. So there's nothing bad in here at all. And again, you thicken the dish with a roux and you just serve it. So again, I think that'd be really nice meal to get on with. Stewed rabbit. much more typical meal was a rabbit stew rather than soup. And again, this comes from Le Marchant's and Rissington. It's a layered stew. So you get a base of Spanish onions, which are larger than but milder than English ones. Then you put jointed rabbit, salt and pepper. Then you repeat the layers until you basically run out of rabbit. The top layer is ham or bacon laid over the top, and the whole thing was oven baked for 2 hours. And any liquid that came out, because there was no liquid added, was thickened with the flour and herbs to make the gravy. And again, that's probably quite nice, although I like rabbit, but it's irritating to eat because it's small bones all the way through it. One for rabbit in cases, and cooking meats wrapped in parchment or in cloth with seasoning was a good way to lock in the flavours, and it also maintained that the meat stayed well cooked yet was succulent. And of course, rabbit in the past was far more popular than it is today, thanks primarily to poaching for the lower classes, but the upper classes often had rabbit warrens. They could actually farm rabbits as well. One interesting sort of social aspect here is that the recipe author writes the phrase at the very bottom, before you send up, meaning before you sent it up from the kitchen upstairs to where the sort of master's family were going to eat it. And we get that quite a lot in these recipes where it says to send up to upstairs. Okay, I mentioned calves head earlier. This is a prickly vile one, I think, to hash a calf's head. The recipe basically says to spoil the calf's head until it's tender, then split it in two. Then one half, the bit with the tongue, is stewed with the gravy, white wine, salt, nutmeg, and the resulting mix thickened with the roux. The other half, you brown it by the fire, then you scoop out the brain, you slice it, you dip it in egg and mace and nutmeg, and then fry it with bacon and forcemeat, which is a mixture of meat, fat, seasoning, and other things. Forcemeat's quite nice. It's like a sausage mixture. I'm not sure the bottom serving instruction, garnish it with slices of lemon, is going to help this. I think this would be a horrific dish to look at and even eat, to be fair. Suckling pig. Pig is one of the first animals to be domesticated. So there are many, many recipes, really old ones, ancient ones, Roman and Greek ones, for suckling pig. And a suckling pig is a pig that's still suckling milk from the mother. So it's a young slaughtered pig, literally 6 to 12 weeks old. It's traditionally cooked whole, usually roasted for special occasions and gatherings. This recipe is a little bit unusual because it actually stands the pig in the oven. So it's quite a late one. Beforehand, you have to cut off the trotters, or the petitoes as they're called, and you have to turn it regularly for about an hour and a half. To serve it, it gets worse now. The head was cut off with a dish dressed with the head, the ears, and the tongue. A side dish of the petitoes and chopped liver, plus a sauce made from the diced brain with samphire and butter. You know, what started off maybe quite nice, it's gone downhill quite rapidly, I think. But we have a saviour, Toad in the Hole. This is from a book 1900. It's a fair book of cookery. There's the guy called Edward Davis. He was a sort of chef and cook wandering around, and it's everybody's favourite toad in the hole. The earliest recipes for toad in the hole, however, used whole joints of meat baked in a batter. So they weren't the sausages that we know. The origin of the name toad in the hole is obscure, but it seems to be quite old, possibly medieval in origins. Today, as I mentioned, the meat is nearly always sausages, but this really only became the norm sometime in the 1920s. And this recipe, again, from 1900, uses a pound of beef cut into pieces, which again makes it a bit of an archaic recipe because within 20 years, sausages have going to be replaced the beef. So again, interesting little recipe here. Curry, one of everybody's favourites. By the late 1600s, Britain was acquiring a taste of curry dishes thanks to growing links with India. And this curry used chicken, which is a rarity in the cooking, really, or rabbit, much more common, and fried onions as the base, as most curries do. Most curries have a fried onion base. And to this, you made a powder of cloves, mace, nutmeg, pepper, curry powder, turmeric, and salt. You added it to a mutton or veal stock, to which was added more onion, blanched ground almonds, cayenne pepper again, and salt. And then this mix was then added to the meat. And it looks like it was marinated, then you cooked it off. And the recipe towards the end, it's a very long recipe, it says the curry should be light and bright yellow. So potentially it's more of a korma because there's actually cream added to it. So it's a southern Indian dish rather than a northern Indian one. But it does actually say the taste is improved by addition of mango pickle. You know, we think that's mango chutney today. And the liquor from the Indian pickle. The Indian pickle was piccalilli. And this gave the sort of the actual dish more of an Indian taste. More of an acid taste, not Indian taste, I should say. Mutton kidneys, broiled mutton kidneys, common recipe found in lots of the cookbooks, cause the sheep's kidneys to be split lengthways, but not separated, and yet only the outer skin and the fat lumps in it will be removed. And they're cooked, they were seasoned with pepper and cayenne and broiled, so grilled on a cast iron griddle like the one here. That would be over the open fire. You do it for about 4 to 5 minutes. Then you serve it on top of a sauce called a maître d'hôtel, which is basically a sauce of melted butter, minced parsley, and lemon sauce, lemon juice or vinegar. And again, that serves it. And again, this is probably edible today, I would think, if you like kidneys. Look at some pies. We've got some pies here. They've been around a long, long time. And again, a recipe for chicken pie has actually been found on a clay tablet in Sumer, Sumerians, prior to sort of 2000 BC. So it's quite an early thing to do a pie. Greeks and Romans made pies. It's probably the Romans who brought them to Britain. The name pie actually means meat or fish enclosed in pastry. It was commonly in use by the 1300s, but it wasn't until the 1500s that you get the non-meat pies began appearing, like apple pies and things. However, the pastry cases were not always used for eating. They're often used simply as a container to hold the food that was to be eaten, and you discard the pastry crust afterwards. And a nicety about pies is they come in sort of 3 main versions: top crust only, bottom crust only, and 2 crust, top and bottom only. And again, going to lots of pubs these days, you know, steak and kidney pie is a top crust. It's wrong. It should be 2 crust always. So, squab pie, a traditional southwest dish. This one comes from the Bathurst family of Lydney. Although the name suggests it contains squabs, which are young pigeons, it's in fact a 2-crust mutton pie with alternating layers of onions, sliced apples, and neck of mutton with some raisins, baked for about 2 hours. Originally, it probably did use pigeon or dove, but mutton was used as a substitute from the early 1700s onwards. And the misnaming of the pie was seemingly for surprise effect. So, you know, when you get squab pie, you're thinking you're going to eat a pigeon, and it's actually a bit of mutton. Interestingly, Charles Dickens knew about this. He disliked it intensely, and he wrote in his journal all the year round that this squab pie was produced nausea and sociability, and in the course of time, the hatred of the whole human race. I think it would be quite nice myself. Today, it's actually amongst the highest listed at-risk British food dishes, and believe there is an at-risk British food list, so it's quite fun to look at. Calf's head pie. This is another recipe from Mrs. Miggins' Pie Shop from Hell. The recipe essentially calls for the calf's head to be boiled until the meat comes off the bones. I'm sorry if you need buckets for this, by the way. The pieces are then cut into walnut-sized pieces and the tongue sliced up. For added enjoyment, I use that word very carefully, you get a quarter of parboiled oysters added to it. And it was a 2-crust pie with the bottom layer of onions and the meat mix, hard-boiled eggs, sliced bacon over the top, and then the top crust. Has to be served in handsome slices with sliced lemon, mutton gravy, ground anchovies, and presumably a bucket very close to hand, because I think this would be absolutely horrific. Fish. Lots about fish. The most common fish eaten by people: salted fish, pickled herrings, and dried cod. The wealthy upper classes could call on less common or more expensive fish types, such as salmon, conger, mullet, shellfish, lobster, and crab. And there was so much salted fish around that cooking sauces and herbs and spices evolved to accompany them to mask the salt taste. Parsley sauce, for example, is a great way of masking the salt taste in fish. People who lived at the coast or by the rivers, like did in Gloucestershire, had a much better choice of fish. And also, you could obviously collect fresh oysters as well, because of course oysters were a commonplace food all over the place, very cheap and eaten by almost everybody. Freshwater fish were an option for people living inland, especially if you had you'd bought the old ruined abbey and got their fish lakes, so, you know, trout, carp, brig, tension eels, all very popular. Our first one, though, is a classic Gloucestershire dish, stewed lampreys. Lamperns is another name for lamprey. It comes from the Guys family of Elmer on the river, and the River Severn was one of the prime lamprey fisheries in the whole of the country. Now, lamprey aren't fish. They're not fish, they're agnatha, which are a class of jawless aquatic invertebrates evolved around about 380 million years ago in the late Devonian period. So they are earlier than plants, earlier than dinosaurs, and they're still around today. So they're quite a wonderful little beastie. And this recipe calls for a well-cleaned lamprey to be added to beaten cloves, mace, salt, pepper flour, old cider, ketchup, port wine, and horseradish, then stewed for around 45 minutes. Now, I have seen a few dishes of lamprey, and I suspect none of them are actually edible, to be honest. Traditionally, Gloucester baked lampreys and pies are sent to the crown, typically at Christmas, but coronations and jubilees and things like that. And I think it's, no wonder the royals didn't like Gloucester if we sent them this thing all the time. Fish balls. Perhaps not the most appetizing of names, but this dish is basically similar to a modern fish cake or your fish fingers. It basically uses mashed potatoes, dressed cooked fish and butter, mixed with cayenne pepper and mace, formed into balls, and you rolled the balls in egg and breadcrumbs and fried them until golden. I think that's a dish that we could all quite happily eat today without even thinking about it. It would be quite tasty. Red mullet, again, quite popular amongst the upper classes. Striped red mullet is a species of goatfish found in the eastern North Atlantic and the Med Sea, from 5 meters to 410. So it's quite, if you've gone in the Med swimming, you're bound to have seen one of these goatfish or its relatives anyway. They're around 25 centimeters, 10 inches long, and up to a pound, 500 grams in weight. Commercially important food species, but they're not overly popular here in the UK, has to be said. And this recipe takes a presumably cleaned fish, it doesn't say, wraps it in paper in a slow oven, but you then bring it out and baste the fish with olive oil, a harvest sauce. Now, this is an English piquant rotten fish or anchovy sauce, which is probably delicious in taste, rather like the Roman fish garum sauce fish. You also put extra anchovies, parsley, and a lot of cayenne pepper in it again. And it's probably edible, I would think. I'd really like to try it. Moving on to fowl and birds, the most common birds eaten were hens, pheasants, partridges, ducks, and geese. Nobles and wealthy landowners hunted wildfowl using falcons, or they bred their own, the dovecot or poultry yard. Poorer people generally kept hens because they were easy to look after and feed, but they were primarily kept for their eggs. So poor people really didn't eat much chicken because the eggs were far more useful and far more important. Then we've got a few recipes, not too many for birds, has to be said. So this is a creme de volaille, and a volaille is simply a French term for the flesh of a chicken used to food. That's it. This recipe comes from the Sharp family, the anti-bishalist Cecil Sharp. Not Cecil, he's the music man, but it uses ground chicken, which is interesting. It's put through a tammy or a tamis, which is a very fine sieve. So you've got almost like a real fine paste of chicken. Then you mix it with cream, egg yolks, pepper, salt, nutmeg, and a small amount of shallot. This is actually emphasised, very small amount of shallot. You then put it into a butter mould, cover it with paper, and you steamed it for an hour. It's served with a bechamel, a white sauce, a sharp sauce. Now, a sharp sauce, they call it a sharply flour sauce made from wine vinegar boiled with sugar, or you do it with a tomato sauce. Not ketchup on this one, it says it's tomato sauce. So again, probably quite nice to eat. A chicken fricassee, we've all heard of this. I remember it's one of the terrifying dishes at school. You never know what was in it. But a fricassee is simply a stew made with pieces of meat that have been browned in butter, and then they're served in a sauce flavoured with cooking stock. That's what a fricassee is. I thought it was the white sort of sauce you used to get in chicken. It's usually made with chicken, veal, or rabbit, and their variations limited really only by what the cook has to hand. First recorded in England in the 1500s, it's a French origin. We think it could be a compound of frire to fry and casse or croisse to break into pieces. And the recipe is actually quite simple. It really is add it together, mix it up, and you cook it. That's it. Move on to vegetables. Most of the veg of the medieval European period, between 600 and 900 years ago, are still popular today. The main difference being that some common vegetables today were not known, i.e. potatoes and peppers. Carrots is always the one that causes a great debate. Were carrots available? Were they not? The general feeling is yes, they were, but they might not have been the orange things that Bugs Bunny eats today. They could have been white or purple more often. So again, it's a little bit unknown on that one. But there are actually relatively few recipes mentioned in vegetables in the archives as a dish on their own, presumably because cooking them was quite standard. You either boiled them on their own or in stews, or you fried them. End of story. Not much else to be done with them. We do have this one, stuffed vegetable marrow. Now, I have to say, marrow's got to be one of the most dull and bland vegetables ever evolved. And if that's not enough, they don't provide much in the way of nourishment either. And in fact, their only real attraction is you can usually produce quite a good yield for a small amount of space. But what's the point? In this recipe for stuffed marrow, it tells the cook what you should do, i.e. cut it in two, scoop out the centre and the pips, but it fails to say what you're going to mix the pulp with. as far as I'm concerned, it's easier just to cut it all out, do that, and just put it in the compost heap and let it get on with it. Pointless eating. Stewed endive. This is really the only other recipe we have in the archives. It's probably for curly endive or chicory endive. We're not quite sure. Calls for it to be boiled until tender, then chopped up and cooked with some thick cream for half an hour. Of course, by this time, it's going to not resemble a vegetable at all. But it would, in the case of chicory, remove the bitter edge you get from chicory, and it would make it supple and tender, i.e. liquid, I would imagine. But that's it, nothing else to it. Got fadge here. That's an interesting one. It's a traditional Ulster Scottish word for a potato bread or a potato cake. This version comes from the Cunton household in the south of the county. It doesn't use potatoes, it uses a brown flour, though it's possible the brown flour might have been potato flour. The potato flour was quite popular at the time. It's cheaper than normal flour. And we know that some recipes used a mix of wheat and potato flour, but basically just mixed up this flour with some butter, salt, baking powder, put it in a quick oven, that's a fast oven, took it out when it's brown. That's it. Looking at sauces, the stock pot and the boiling pots were probably the most important pieces in the kitchen. They were the basis for all stock, soups, stews, gravies, and sauces. And making a sauce or stock could often take 4 or 5 days. They would be really important. It could use huge amounts of ingredients, including fresh and old meats, mutton, veal, poultry, trimmings, fish heads and bones for fish sauces, onions, butter, carrots, turnip, everything could go into these stews, and it would just stay there bubbling away, and you'd take it out. So it's rather like going to the cupboard today, getting grabbing an OXO cube, and the cubes are available, and just using those. So again, these weren't available, so you had to make your own. So we're going to look at some of the sauces now. Here's 2 classic sauces that we eat today. The first one, bread sauce. Basically thin slices of bread, cream, butter and shallots, boiled and beaten to a paste, then a bechamel sauce and cream added. Popular with chicken and turkey, especially at Christmas. That's all right, take it or leave it myself, but it's a very similar recipe to the one we use today. Tomato sauce. Roasted tomatoes, skin them and stew them without water, but add onions, peppercorns and salt. This is very similar to one of Delia's recipes that I actually made the other day, because I've got a glut of tomatoes at the moment. And again, the drawback with all this stuff is how do you store it? You're making a lot of stuff here. Storing is the problem, or you eat it quick. Walnut ketchup. So a ketchup or catsup, I don't even pronounce that, ketchup goes. It's a table condiment. We all know about it. It's sweet and sour flavour. It can be quite tasty. The term ketchup first appeared in 1682. Historically, the first ketchups were prepared with mushrooms as the main ingredient, but other ones used egg whites, oysters, cockles, grapes, mussels, or walnuts. This is one from the Danvers family of Thornbury. Tomato ketchup comes later. We've got a recipe for that, but look at it in a minute. But this basically used pulped walnuts, anchovies, shallots, mace, cloves. Jamaica pepper came into this one. Paprika, which again, why it says it's Jamaican when most paprika is from sort of the Hungarian sort of area of Europe, but don't know, and white wine vinegar. And he mixed it all up basically. And this one says you could keep it for months and years, 2 years if you bottled it properly and kept it. Interesting that I'm not sure how that would really work, but there you go. There's the original tomato ketchup, or this recipe actually does say ketchup. It's a familiar sauce, mashes your tomatoes with salt, lets them stand for 2 days. Presumably it's going to generate more flavour then. Afterwards, you strain that mix. That is going to get rid of all the skin and all the pips. So you're going to get a fine tomato sort of base sauce. Put it on a cold fire, heat it up, take any scum off the top, add cloves, mace, nutmeg, ginger, whole peppercorn, 3 or 4 cloves of garlic, let it boil for 20 minutes. And then when it's cool, you basically leave it to bottle it. So again, quite a common thing, and these would have been made all the time. And this is your equivalent to the old Heinz or the HP sort of sauces we get today. Looking at desserts, puddings and sweets. So we're on the sweet course now. Wood pudding comes from Middle English, podlin. It actually means a meat-filled animal stomach. And traditionally, puddings were boiled in linen cloth or bags and were cooked in the copper, the wash house boiler. And this is one from James Austin's house. It basically has a big copper pot sat on top of furnace, kept enclosed with bricks. Didn't use much fuel to heat things up very quickly, and would come hot. Boiled puddings are very popular because the small ovens of the kitchen granges they did not reach a massively high temperature without a lot of attention to the fire. But the hobble fire compartment could boil the water quite easily. So it's much easier to cook a food by boiling it rather than try and control the temperature of the fires. By the 1600s, puddings could be savoury, so meat-based or sweet ones, although by the end of the 1700s, most had lost the meat content. The meat content vanishes from puddings, really apart from sort of your steak and kidney pies, which are still sort of suet-based today. Well, the good ones are anyway. So new few puddings. This is a Bicton pudding. We think it comes from Bicton House near Budley Salterton, Devon, the home of the Roll family, although there's a lesser contender, could be Bicton Hall near Shrewsbury, although I couldn't find anybody really important living there. And because this comes from the Codrington family, expect they're visiting people of their own status rather than sort of lower ones. It's a pretty standard pudding mix, to be honest, using eggs, their equal weights in butter, lump sugar, which have been crushed to granules, and flour. The only enhancement is some almond flavouring, and it was boiled for about 3 hours. So again, a lot of these boilings went on for ages and ages. Audley End pudding. This is an interesting one. Audley End, it's a huge 17th century house at Saffron Walden in Essex. It's a prodigy house, one of these show-off houses. By the 1860s, it came into the Braybrooke family, and Charles Neville, the fifth Baron, inherited everything. He originally had, at the time of this recipe, 1874, we're not sure, he either had a cook called Avis Crocombe, we'll more about it in a minute, or he had a Frenchman called Missionnaire. Now, Missionnaire, we think, was earlier. So this could be his recipe, or it could be Mrs. Crocombe's recipe. We're not sure. I'll go for the latter. She actually only stayed at the house for about 4 years before she married and went off and was a cook somewhere else. But this seems to this pudding seems to have translated it. So again, it's one from the Codrington family, and they've probably gone to meet the Braybrookes or had dinner with them, and they've asked for this recipe. It just fairly basic one. So flour, milk, cream, butter, sugar, simmer gently, and produced a sweet like a creme caramel, and the top was burnt with a salamander. So it probably is identical to a creme caramel today. It was a creme brulee, not creme caramel. So yeah, it's one of these, but it's a really interesting story. Now, if you put Avis Crocombe name into the internet, you'll get onto the English Heritage website for Audley, and they've done a series of videos, and there's an actress, Kate Hasseldale, I think her name is, who basically portrays Avis Crocombe in the kitchen, and there's it's really good fun. Thoroughly recommend it. It's really popular. There's about 10 or 12 videos that she's done, so I thoroughly recommend you chase that up. So English Heritage, Audley End, Avis Crocombe, you'll be there for a few hours. Manchester pudding, common name. Sometimes an alternative name is the Queen of Puddings. It's basically a sweetbread pudding baked in a pastry-lined dish. So this recipe uses milk, grated bread, breadcrumbs, lemon rind, egg yolks and egg whites, melted butter, and the addition of sweetmeats, then such as currants, raspberries or black currants, or you can throw the raspberries away straight away as an offence to none. You then sweeten it to taste and serve it. So again, quite a common pot pudding, cooked a lot today as well. This is more like it. Apple fritters. These are made with a batter of eggs, flour, cream, sugar, nutmeg, mace, and cinnamon. It's beaten and then rested for 3 hours. So again, it's standing a batter like we often do today. Before you cook it, you put 5 spoons of scalded sack. Sack is a fortified wine from Spain or Portugal. You can also put brandy, ale, or beer into it. You add these up to the batter, and then basically the apples are small pippins. I couldn't put it in here, but I've done a bit of research on that, and there could be pippins from either side of the 7 here. So on the exhibition that will follow this website, there is I've used this recipe, and there's an explanation of what the there's about 10 or 12 apple types it could be, but you basically slice these up wafer thin, and you dip them in the batter and fry them in beef dripping or hog's lard, and I think they would be absolutely delicious. On mouth's watering already. Make a trifle. There were trifles back then. Everybody's treated at Christmas. This uses macaroons, presumably pre-made. You soak them in white wine or brandy, put a topping made of sugar, cream, and lemon rind, and the cook had to whip this up to strong froth. In this instance, there's no mention of a jelly, so that must have come later at some point. Look at preserving food, because preserving food is critical to get most families through the winter months, especially the poorer ones. So there are 4 main methods of preserving. You've got pickling. This uses an antimicrobial liquid that kills bacteria, good for everything really: vegetables, fish, fruits, meats, mushrooms, dairy, and eggs. Drying, it removes the moisture, again inhibits the growth of bacteria, yeast, and molds. quite good for fish and meat. Smoking, which is a method of drying that imparts a smoky flavour to the food, again, usually reserved for meat or fish. Salting, this preserves food by drawing water out of the food, so preventing bacteria from growing. Good for meat and white fish. These two quantities were used heavily. And I should just quickly mention registration. Prior to the 1950s, rudimentary at best. You either needed an ice house. This is a picture of the ice house at Doddington Park here, which was probably done by Capability Brown, a huge building. You basically filled it up with ice and snow in the winter and put your stuff on top of it to keep things cool. You've got to be a wealthy landowner to have that. Or you could have an ice box, which is the picture here. So it's basically you'd get some ice, put it in the back, close the doors. As the ice melted, it would take the heat away. I remember one of these in the 1960s when I was camping with my grandparents. You put ice and water at the top and it kept it cold for a little while. Or another way of doing it, if you had a big enough house, you had a sluice room where you could actually run water over marble surfaces continuously. This had the same effect as keeping it cool. One of these you can see at Barrington House up near Leicester there. So some pickles here. We have Colonel Wild's pickle. Technically, it's not a pickle, it's a chutney. Pickles are made using whole fruits and veg, while technically chutneys are made using small chopped pieces of fruits and vegetables. So Branston pickle, sorry, Branston, it should be Branston chutney. But there we go, we call it pickle. This looks like a standard recipe. It uses basically onions, Spanish ones, apples and white vinegar. But then the secret ingredient, 1/4 pound of red chilies. That's going to be quite fiery, I would imagine. I had a look, I can't find anybody of any note called Colonel Wild. So whether it was somebody that this is from the Lamarchant family of Richmond, whether it was somebody this they knew, presumably, I don't know, Indian recipe maybe, but I don't know. We don't know. Couldn't find who it was. If anybody can find out who Colonel Wild is, please let me know. Typical white cabbage. This recipe probably produces something similar to a sauerkraut. It's quite unusual that it causes the cabbage to be either quartered or shredded, to be scalded for 4 minutes, then salted. When it's cooled, it's put in a container and you cover it with a pickling liquid, which in this case is vinegar, pepper, mace, and salt. And then you seal it with wax paper and leave it in there. Again, probably a sauerkraut. It will probably ferment with think, but I'm not 100% sure on that one. Pickled horse, dog rose, the horse are, it's a climbing wild rose, get lovely white pink flowers, and the rose hips are the most common bit of the plant used in food. Used to make jams, jellies, pies, stews, teas, and as in spray, you can preserve it in vinegar as a pickle. They're really good in vitamin C, 20 times more than oranges. So they're really important scurvy preventative, especially sort of, from 1900 onwards, and people knew about this. And they also are very common in the war. People often have, your rose hip syrup, that sort of thing. I'm sure we remember as kids taking that, or well, not taking it, your mum forcing it down your throat, basically. I remember that. This recipe comes from the Bathurst family science test and uses saltpeter, aka potassium nitrate. This is more commonly used in fertilizers, rocket propellants, fireworks, and black powder, gunpowder. But it's also one of the main sort of pickling ingredients. So it actually does pickle very well with other things as well. And it does crop up in several of the recipes we have. To pickle beef or tongues, this recipe doesn't use vinegar but uses brine, 4 gallons of water, 1.5 pounds of moist sugar, treacle 2 ounces of saltpeter, 3 pounds of bay salt, which is sea salt, and 3 pounds of common salt. So 6 pounds of salt, a lot of salt going into this. Mix is boiled, and when the scum's floated up, take it off and let it cool. The recipe here states that the pickle after 10 weeks is as good as fresh as only within 3 days. Not much of an advert. And again, the saltpeter here acts as a curing agent. And this probably results in a very wet corned beef or a salt beef. So again, it's a recipe that's still used today. And this recipe also states that you can extend the shelf life of this by boiling it once a month and adding sugar, treacle, and salt to it, and then letting it cool again. Quite hard to go on for, I'm not sure. I mentioned carves, we've done looked a lot of them. I had to include this recipe. Again, this is vile. Of course, the carve head still have its skin on, and you make a deep cut in the neck and the throat and the nose, boil it for an hour, after which you pick the hair off. That's going to take you 2 or 3 days, isn't it? And you put it in a suitable pickling container. There's a lot of mangled English in this recipe, but it uses milk, another pickling juice, onions, spices, typically bay peppercorns. Using these 3 combinations again as a pickle was fairly common, usually boiled up. You know, and it's a very disjointed recipe. But again, I put it just for an example of, you know, what they used to do. Pickled fish, not our favourite in this country, but it's a Scandinavian technique which works well with mackerel, especially, but you've got cockles and mussels and that sort of thing, winkles. It's a classic sousing recipe: vinegar, water, salt, peppercorns, and bay leaves. Interestingly, most of these recipes boil the liquids without the fish, and let it cool before you add the fillets. This one adds the fish at the start, then you put it in the oven for 24 hours. So this is, you know, I would imagine this is quite an unusual pickle of some sort. Getting better now. Moving on to cakes. Cakes. The word cake originally comes from the Norse word kaka, Viking origin. We know cakes have been around since Roman, where bread dough is sometimes enriched with butter, eggs, and honey. Early cakes in England were essentially bread. The most obvious difference between a cake and bread was that the round, flat shape of the cakes and the cooking method. So, the cooking method usually turned cakes over once while cooking, while bread was left upright. Sponge cakes is the more common cake today, which the actual mixture is leavened with beaten eggs, originated during the Renaissance, we think primarily in Spain. But when ovens became to become more common, cakes were easier to cook. And they were usually the second or third item to be baked after bread, when the oven was actually cooling down. Got a few of these. Classic Madeira cake, very traditional for us. It's sometimes thought it originated from the Madeira Islands, but it isn't the case. It was named after Madeira wine, which is a Portuguese fortified wine, which was usually served with the cake. So you'd have this basic cake, you'd serve it with Madeira wine, hence the cake became Madeira cake. Again, this recipe is unusual, as it gives us some cooking instructions. You bake in a moderate oven. There you go. Sponge cake, a standard recipe for sponge cake, more or less. This is flour, sugar, and eggs, into which you add the juice and rind of a lemon. The drawback here is this mixture state you should beat the mixture for an hour. You know, that's going to tax anybody. You know, and you can imagine the sort of the run of kitchen maids, each doing 10 or 15 minutes doing this, then redoing it again. Doesn't require very much flour, just the weight of 2.5 eggs in their shells. So it's about 4.5 ounces, you know, maybe 150 grams worth of flour. As I say, I'm the one who likes to eat cake. I have no idea of how it works. But again, as with the previous recipe, we've got a little guide as to how you should cook this. You should put it into a rather cool oven. Lady Georgiana Codrington was the wife of Christopher William Codrington, Donington Park. She was quite a famous lady, sponsored homeopathy. She attended fundraising events, so she supported the London Homeopathic Hospital. This is a breakfast cake. These are usually actually French in origin and are generally less sweet and plainer than normal cake. So in this recipe, where she's added raisins into it, must have been quite a personal choice. And that's a picture of her on the left-hand side, and there's your recipe there. Scones, how we pronounce it, everybody's favourite tea time treat. Like Welsh cakes, every family have their own recipe or variant of it. This is just a classic one, again, from the Codrington household. We won't get into the jam v cream argument. Everybody knows it's the Cornish jam first way, which is correct, and we'll have no arguments about that whatsoever. Biscuits. In most English-speaking countries, biscuits are a flour-based, baked, hard, flat, and unleavened. They're usually sweet, maybe made with sugar, chocolate, icing, jam, ginger, or cinnamon. By medieval times, biscuits were made from a sweet and spice mix of breadcrumbs and then baked, so like a gingerbread, or from cooked bread enriched with sugar and spices and baked again. So your modern biscuit only really appeared when the supply of sugar and the refinement supply of flour coincided with the Industrial Revolution, allowing a mass production of these things. And literally, we've never looked back since. 3 recipes from the Codrington family here. Pretty lack of imagination in these, but hopefully they look better. Top one is Doddington biscuits, and it's got more salt than most of this. So this might have actually made some sort of cracker, possibly for cheese, I'm not sure. The middle one is thin biscuits. This calls for the butter to be dissolved in hot water, which you can't do. It makes an emulsion rather than dissolves. And it would probably help to sort of make the biscuits quite hard, quite thin, and quite tough, we think. But we're going to be trying to make some of these at some point. The last one is the hard biscuits. The addition here of cream probably helps to the richness, but the fact that they're hard, you know, you might want to dip them in your tea quite a lot, I would think. Moving on, offal, it mostly is. Got to include brawn. in the 1600s, brawn was boiled down muscle meat, and the name brawn means muscle, and mostly from the buttocks of an animal, boiled with pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and mace and salt. As time passed, it referred to a meat product that's essentially a whole calf or pig's head, boiled with spices till the meat fell away, and then the rest of it set in aspic jelly as a slab to be eaten cold. It's not. I've always thought brawn's horrific. My old man loved it. I think it's dreadful. But it's a thought of that isn't bad enough. The alternate name for it was head cheese, which again I think it tells you a lot about it. Or potluck. Again, you know, what are you eating? You don't know. This was to make black puddings. We all love a bit of black pudding. Every bit of the pig you can eat except the squeal. Black pudding's been around since the 1400s. We've got this one recipe for it. It's quite popular. It uses half a quarter of the guts of the animal, milk, fat, leeks, pennyroyal mint, a fine black pepper, salt, and Jamaican pepper up and paprika in it again. I've just come back from Yorkshire and some fantastic black pudding, which is why I've included this. Okay, look at some drinks. Beef tea, very firm favourite today. There's lots of brands of it around. Again, this comes from the Contring family. Uses a pound of beef soaked in 1 pint of water with a layer of beef dripping added for good measure. The recipe advises using rump steak. I mean, again, this is surely a case of not everybody can afford this. Most people are going to be making it out of a much cheaper cut of meat. And again, it was used as an invalid thing. You know, if you're not feeling well, you have a big beef tea to help cheer you up. A couple of wine recipes. Cowslip wine, not very common today. Cowslips actually produce a narcotic juice, so it's not surprisingly is a popular plant to use to make wine, especially if you added brandy to it, which a lot of recipes did. Cowslip is actually a distorted pronunciation of cowslop, i.e. cowslots, because the flower cowpats, or so the flowers are associated with cowpats in meadows and fields, so that's where it comes from, which is again a lovely little thing. And the flower is not only used for wine, but also for tea and other medicinal purposes too, for treating headaches, insomnia, and nerves. So again, quite a popular and well-used plant. Elderberry wine here, quite a long, complex recipe. Elderberry wine's been made for hundreds, thousands of years, really. And like other fruit wines, it's made in the cooler regions where grapes can't really flourish. And elderflowers are often planted in hedgerows, which means they're available readily around homes and fields. And again, they're still collected quite happily today. The quantities in this actual recipe are quite good. 5 gallons of elderberries and 10 gallons of water. So you're going to use a huge pan to heat this. The kitchen copper would have been very busy, I think. Some local treats now. Cheese. Cheesemakers got an interesting history, thought to originate around about 8000 BC when sheep were first domesticated. And interestingly, as animals' skins and foodstuffs of internal organs were often used to store food, we think cheese was discovered by accidentally storing milk in the stomach of an animal, and the resulting milk turned to curd and whey by the rennet from the stomach, because the rennet's the main ingredient that helps make cheese into cheese. We've got 2 very famous cheeses, as I'm sure you all know, but lots of others were made, and cheese making was essentially a way of turning surplus milk into a food that could be stored and eaten throughout the winter months. So it's a very important commodity. So obviously Gloucestershire, we've got single and double Gloucester cheese. So what's the difference? Single Gloucester, this is made at the beginning and the tail end of the season, so spring and early autumn, where animals were often fed on hay because there was less green grass around. So they produced less milk, which gave a smaller, less acidic, wetter cheese that matured quite quickly, just 8 weeks, but it didn't keep. Okay, so your double Gloucester, made at the height of the season, so May to July, when there is a surplus of milk, which resulted in larger cheeses, twice the size usually, hence the word double, and they were more acidic, they were drier and matured more slowly, so 4 to 8 months, and they kept quite well. So the upshot of this is that single Gloucester was eaten locally by local people, so it wasn't exported, so not many people knew about it, whereas double Gloucester could be exported, and it became well known. I mean, these are from Martell's farm. Other farm cheeses are available in Gloucestershire, and if you've not tried single Gloucester, I thoroughly recommend you do it. It's really good cheese. So this is a recipe from the archive of the Hyatt and Dickinson families, and they've got a fantastic volume dedicated to preserving fruit and making cheese, including recipes how to produce rennet to make cheese. There's about 5 or 6 of them. Just got one here. I've got a couple here. Here we go. So this is for a thick cheese. We think it's the work of Sarah Hunt, the wife of Dr. William Adams Oxford, written around about 1740. Sorry, the cheese was pressed in a cheese press, wrapped in a cloth, changing it every day for a month. Can't really go into the full instructions; it's too long. But a lot of these recipes have the months or seasons when they could be made. And this is the great example, because this recipe states at the bottom, this must not be made in June or July, for it will be maggoty if it's made in hot weather. You know, that's enough to put you off. But I mean, you know, what's worse than finding the classic, what's worse than finding a maggot in your apple, finding half a maggot, etc. But there's some great recipes here. This is another one from the same book. This is Mrs. Morden's cheese. We don't know who Mrs. Morden was, but she obviously made good cheeses because they were supposed to be down. This cheese used morning milk and was only to be made at the latter end of August and September, and it produced another hard cheese. This one, Slipcote cheese. Slipcote or Slipcote cheese is unripened, very soft white cheese formed in a small mould or moulded in leaves, and it was used for immediate consumption by farming households. These two recipes from Avonside and Painswick used rushes, probably from the banks of the Painswick Stream, and nettles to wrap the cheeses in. And a Cornish yard uses nettle today, doesn't it? It's thought the name from slip, meaning little, and cot, meaning cottage. So this is, we think, more like a cottage cheese. Today, there is very rare. There's one place that makes it, the High Wheel Dairy in West Sussex. So if you ever pass it that way, do to call it and get some. The 1653 cookbook, A True Gentlewoman's Delight, recommended if you find any mouse turd, wipe it off. The cheese will come to be eaten to be good in 8 or 9 days. So, you know, I'm not quite sure that's highly recommended, but they used to do it. Elvers, juvenile eels, historically important foodstuff in the Severn Valley. The eels coming from the Sargasso Sea, from the spawning grounds, carried upstream on spring tides at night, caught in great quantities, prized by Gloucestershire locals, free source of food. But today they're a complete delicacy, priced up to £100 a pound, £2,000 a kilo, sometimes more. They would be sold live by the pint and cooked by frying them in bacon or in bacon fat. At Frampton on Severn, down the Nursery, they had the celebration of the Elvers' annual arrival spawned a competitive eating contest. The winner being the person who could eat £1 of Elvers, about 1,000 of them, that is, in the shortest time. The record is 43 seconds, set on the 13th of April 1971 by a local farmer. Today they can't do that because the Elvers are endangered, they're critically endangered, so they actually use Spanish Elvers, which are spaghetti-style surimi fish meat. So it still goes on there, and it's quite fun to watch. Painswick Barrow Pie, first Sunday after 19th September. Painswick has an annual feast day. You get 3 customs. You get feasting, obviously, clipping the church, sometimes spelled clipping, and eating dog pie. Clipping the church essentially involved townsfolk joining hands and dancing around the church to embrace it into the community. Feasting is obvious. But dog pie, well, it's not made of dog pie. It's basically a porcelain pie with a giant dog on top, baked annually between 1870 and 1880. Somehow believed to be connected with Roman offerings to wolf gods. But the other legend goes around, a local landlord once ran out of meat on the feast day, so he caught some stray dogs to put in his pies, and the story's been there ever since. Not too many slides left now. This is Gloucester jelly. We have a couple of recipes for this, and again, it was a tonic or a food supplement for the sick. It used isinglass, which is dry collagen from swim bladders of fish, you could use for clarification of beer or as a glue, whatever you needed. Sago, rice, pearl barley, and eringo root, which is sea holly. And this has been used as an ingredient, as a vegetable, or candid as an aphrodisiac for many years. These ingredients are mixed down with 2 or 3 pints of water, boiled down to form 2 pints, and then it cold, it formed the jelly. You would then dissolve a teacupful in milk with sugar or wine and take it 2 to 3 times a day. This was a new one to me. I've not heard about this one before, but it looks quite an interesting one. Painswick Weeks, they're actually a type of Swedish bread roll using flour, sugar, butter, and barm. Now, barm is the old term for yeast. Usually, it's the yeast-rich froth left over from brewing beer. If you go up north to Hull and Humberside, you get barm cakes, which is their name for bread rolls. So this is probably something very similar. This comes from the pocketbook of a William Barrett, who was a Cheltenham German baker. He moved to Gloucester in 1746, but he seems to have retained an interest in the Barrett's Mill at Cheltenham, which is down by the Sanford Ale House, and he possibly made bread on the premises, we're not sure. And interestingly, he recorded all manner of things in this pocketbook. It's the price of corn, cost of ingredients, and various recipes for cakes, breads, horse ailments, and human remedies. So it's quite an entertaining read. And a couple of slides left now. Finally, part one. Some of these recipes you just think, why? I mean, apart from the carbs. This is one. This is toast water. You basically took toast, soaked it in water until the water turned brown. Some recipes added lemon rind to this. You'd then strain it and drink it cold with or without milk or cream and sugar. And again, it's probably an invalid's drink, but why? What's the good of drinking water made from bread? And crazy. And then you got this one. There are some recipes. This is hot cheese custard. We have cheese over custards, but most include breadcrumbs. This one doesn't. But there's a very similar recipe from Kent, which is a baked one. And this one just burns the top with a salamander to brown it. I mean, hot cheese custard, I think, is as disgusting as it probably comes. So that's the end of the talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's been a bit of a long one and it galloped through all this. And we can take some questions using the chat. I'll just remind you that our next event here at the Heritage Hub is on Saturday, 7th of October, and it's knife, fork and spoon. So it's got the usual mix of, we've got talks, archive films on food, shops and suppliers, etc. We've got tasting sessions on ethnic cookery, local produce. There's going to be a couple of recipes, I think, from this talk. They're the safe ones. Don't worry, not going to come with a calf's head. We've got a document display here. So some of the things you've seen on the images there, you'll be able to see properly. And as always, the Family History Association are here to stir up your interest about your ancestors. And again, as always, we've got free refreshments throughout the afternoon. As space is limited, we do ask if you want to come to the talks, please use that website to book on. And finally, before I say, hand over back to Gemma. Our next Secrets Revealed online talk is Wednesday, 25th of October. It's Secrets Revealed online talk, Goodbye. It's a look at the various records relating to World War I that we have here at the archives. So thank you very much, Justine, and hand back to you, Gemma.
Thank you very much, John. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm not sure now whether I'm hungry or slightly nauseous after all those recipes. So we've just got a couple of comments in the chat. First of all, Tony says that cool could be cool fat, used as wrapping for cooking meat and meat products such as the ones used in faggots. Sue James has, did you want to say anything, John, about that?
Come live, yes. No, that's probably good. That corn fat could be quite white. I hadn't even thought about that. So it's good point. It's what I like about the answers and questions here. I get told or I've gone wrong. Brilliant.
Thank you. Sue James said that she never had curry until she went to university in 1986, and her dad was very much a meat and tea veg man, which is something I'm sure a lot of us will find very familiar. Tony has also mentioned that allspice is sometimes referred to as Jamaica pepper and forms part of Jamaican jerk seasoning. Sue has mentioned that her gran used to eat tripe, so did mine, Sue. And Tony was saying that would be £220 a kilo for Elvers. He's asking that as a question, John. Is there
Yeah, it is that price, but you really can't get them now because they're actually being, where they are caught legally, they are tended to be taken away and try and restock other rivers. So most of our commercial elvers now, if you can get them, come from Spain. I remember back in 2009, the local flower shop on London Road got some Spanish tinned elvers in, and there is I remember queuing about 15-20 minutes to get them. I bought, I think, three cans, and they were the size of like a sort of canned mackerel you get nowadays, and that was 20 quid. And I bought them for my mum because I knew my mum liked them. So we had one, and they were done in olive oil and garlic, and they were not like the elvers of old. I still got an open can in our River 7 project box that I drag out occasionally. I can't remember what happened to the third can. I think I opened it up here for people to try, and obviously nobody did. But yeah, so yeah, the Elvers, you just can't get them now, sadly. But I have tried the Elvers Spanish version, and that's not bad. It's all right. It brings a bit of a memory back, if nothing else.
Thanks, John. And Tony and also Sue have asked about whether there's a drippers recipe, which Tony was saying was one of his favourites. Yeah, still one of mine as well, Tony. Did you come across anything like that, John?
Sadly, no. We've got no drip recipes here at all. I mean, obviously the world famous drips of Sparks' Bakery down Rycross Street. I used to work about 2 doors away. Every day, go up and get our drips from there. No, not one of those I found recipes. Now I started to look through these archive recipes. When I actually put recipe into our online catalogue, I think I got something like 15,000 hits. I only did like the first 6 or 8 pages of the catalogue, going through, pulling out recipes, thinking, I'll go and have a look at that one. So there's probably lots more that I've not looked at here in the archives. But again, I would have thought I would have come across some sort of recipe for a beef dripper going all the way through. But I suspect that because it was maybe so common, that may be why they're not in there. So I think a lot of these common recipes, again, because everybody knew how to do them, they didn't get put into print and weren't written down. I suspect these were sort of like the icing of the cake, the ones that people didn't really want to lose. So I would love to find, I could cook a drip. I'd still happily buy them today from Jane's Pantry, wherever we go. But sadly, Sparks is a long gone, and that's a real shame.
Marvellous. Thank you ever such a lot, John. And Jane also said to say that was fascinating, and thank you very much. So I think that probably draws us to the end. So thank you to everybody for coming along to the talk today. And thank you so much, John, for another amazing talk. Really appreciate it. That was just fantastic. Okay, thank you very much. Please don't forget to come to some of our future events, and we hope to see you at the next Secrets Revealed talk. Thank you.